I forgot to raise my camera. Hey, everybody. This is Elaine Belson again. Welcome to Ask Me Anything, where I answer your questions live. This is related to mental health. I am a psychotherapist. So let me just start by saying that um, just a few reminders. This feed is live, but it's also being recorded. Advice given on this show is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional psychological or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Questions and concerns about your mental health should be discussed with a qualified professional. Any use of this information is the sole responsibility of the listener. If you have thoughts of harming yourself or someone else, call 988 or go to the nearest emergency room. If you are watching this recorded, then please feel free to enter some questions in the comment section under the video, and I will answer them if I don't get any live questions. Question that I got was from, her name is Mama Foxfire, and she asks, what resources or exercises do you think would be appropriate for someone experiencing imposter syndrome? So, imposter syndrome is very common. In fact, what I find is that most people walk around with these feelings of inadequacy. That is, I'm not good enough, there's something inherently wrong with me, or I'm undeserving. And it's so common that, I very rarely come across someone who doesn't feel this way. And I've had colleagues who say the same thing. So it's almost universal. And the reason for this, I'm not exactly sure whether it's nature or nurture, whether it's just something that we're born with, or whether it comes from growing up in a dysfunctional family where we got this negative messaging that we're undeserving, that we're not good enough, or that there's something inherently wrong with us, or that we chose to compensate for maybe um, a dysfunctional upbringing by thinking these things about ourselves, right? And I'll talk more about that. So, why do people choose, right, to focus on or think this way? Well, I think that it is a coping mechanism for fear of failure and rejection. Now, everyone is afraid of failure and rejection. That is just innate. It's a survival mechanism. But the way people tend to cope with it has a lot to do with how they feel about themselves. And what most people do is they ruminate. And I talked about that in the previous episode. That is, they mind read, second guess themselves, they anticipate other people's reactions, they self criticize, they overanalyze, they compare themselves to others. So they do all these things because underneath it all, they feel like, well, I can't just be myself. I'm not good enough the way that I am. I'm undeserving. And so, therefore, I have to do these things in order to avoid rejection and failure. Even though, when we're talking to somebody else, especially somebody we care about, we would never say to them, if you want to avoid rejection or failure, here's what you need to do. You need to mind read. You need to second guess yourself. You need to anticipate other people's reactions. You need to self criticize, and you need to compare yourself to others. Sounds pretty ridiculous, right? But that's exactly what we tell ourselves. And we tell ourselves that if we don't do those things, then we will surely be rejected or surely fail because we're undeserving. We're not good enough the way that we are, right? There's something inherently wrong with us, right? So imposter syndrome is really that. That's what it is. It's those feelings of inadequacy. And the way that we tend to deal with those feelings of inadequacy is to ruminate. So, what do you want to do instead? Well, what is really important to do is to learn how to self validate. And this is actually easier than you think because it's something that you do for other people all the time. So, I will talk more about that. But what you're what you're doing is you're going to stop using other people as mirrors for a sense of self. Most people walk around like a cup with a hole in it. That is, um, they need that constant validation or reassurance that there's nothing inherently wrong with them or that they are deserving, right? And so the problem with that is that you constantly need that reassurance and that validation because your cup has a hole in it, right? And so you need to plug up that hole so that you stop needing that reassurance and validation all the time. Because for one thing, it can affect how you react to other people's behavior, right? As well as affect how you feel about yourself. So what you do is you learn how to self-validate. And I have two types of self-validation. The first one is what I call be your own best friend. So if you're engaging in ruminating, there's that imposter syndrome. I'm undeserving, or there's something inherently wrong with me, or I'm not good enough, right? That's the imposter syndrome. What you want to do is you want to stop and ask yourself, would I say these same things to somebody else that I care about? Would I say to somebody else, oh, you're not good enough, or you don't deserve this, or there's something wrong with you? And the chances are the answer is no, number one. And then, I would ask, why don't you say those things to somebody else? And the answer is, first of all, well, that's mean, right? Right. That's not the way you treat people, right? Those are your values. This is not the way I treat people. Secondly, you recognize that this is not going to be helpful. It's just going to make the person feel worse. Right. So you have to remember that when you talk to yourself that way, it's exactly the same, right? You're just making yourself feel worse. It's not helpful. Um, and so it's not even going to help you to avoid the thing that it is that you're afraid of, right? So if you feel undeserving or inadequate in some way, um, it's recognizing that the way to cope with that is not to beat yourself up because you recognize that if somebody else came to you and said, well, I don't feel good enough or I don't feel deserving, you recognize that the way to help them would not be to beat them down, to criticize them, right? So, what does work? What would you think about if you wouldn't speak to them that way, right? What would you do instead, right? Chances are you would ask for more information. Well, what makes you feel that way? Tell me more about the situation. What happened? Where is this coming from? What is it that you're afraid of? And then, well, let's look at what's in your control. What can you do about that? So it's the same when you're talking to yourself. First, you ask yourself, would I say this to somebody else? And if the answer is no, I would not speak to somebody else that way. Well, then you certainly shouldn't be speaking to yourself that way. Right. And again, you recognize that the reason why is because you recognize that it's not helpful. It's just going to make you feel worse. And then what you do is you ask yourself, well, what would be a more constructive way of talking to myself if I want to avoid rejection and failure? It would be to problem solve, would be to ask myself, where is this coming from? In other words, what specifically is making me feel this way? And then what's in my control to avoid the rejection or failure? So that's why I call it being your own best friend. And this applies anytime you catch yourself speaking negatively to yourself, right? So engaging in imposter syndrome, right? And telling yourself that you're not good enough or you're undeserving. Stop and ask yourself, okay, what am I feeling right now? There's an insecurity underneath, there's an anxiety underneath. Chances are the feeling is fear of rejection or failure. And so ask yourself specifically, what is it that I'm afraid of will happen? And then what is in my control to avoid it? So you want to be problem solving oriented, because that is the only way that you're going to avoid the rejection or failure. And that is why you have the feelings to begin with. They're there to help you to problem solve. Um, the other type of self validation is when somebody else is making you feel bad about yourself. And so basically, they say or do something that makes you question yourself. And again, that can lead to imposter syndrome. Well, maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe I don't deserve this because this person was mad at me or they criticized me in some way. And so, what you want to do in this situation is you want to ask yourself, if the situation were reversed, would I talk to this person the way they're talking to me? Would I treat that person the way that they're treating me? Right? And if the answer is no, that is not the way I would treat that person, well, then again, that's telling you something. That's telling you that these are your values. This is the way you treat people. And you recognize that way, the way the other person is treating you is not helpful. It's not constructive. It's just going to make that person feel worse. And so I call this the opposite of the golden rule. So we know what the golden rule is. It's treat other people the way you want to be treated. So the opposite of the golden rule is you have a right to be treated the way you treat other people. So if somebody is making you feel bad about yourself, then ask yourself, if the situation reversed, would I treat them that way? And if the answer is no, well, then again, that tells you that that person is treating you, the way that person's treating you, right, has everything to do with them, right? Because you know that you don't treat people that way. Doesn't matter who they are, right? Those are your values, right? And that is the way that and that is the way you recognize that what is helpful or unhelpful. So in both situations, what you're doing is you're going from relying on other people as mirrors to relying on yourself, your values, and the way that you think and feel, instead of the way other people might think and feel, or their values, or the way that you fear. That you're basing your sense of self not on fear and insecurity, but on values and reason mind. Let me say that again. So when you self-validate using be your own best friend and opposite of the golden rule, what you're doing is, instead of basing your sense of self on fear and insecurity, you're basing your sense of self on your values and rational mind. Some other strategies are asking yourself, what's in my control? So if we're feeling inadequate in some way, feeling this imposter syndrome, then, the assumption is that we're afraid, right? That we're not good enough and that we're not going to be able to handle the situation, right? So we don't trust ourselves, whatever it is, right? Whatever the role is. And so there's a fear there. There's an underlying um, sort of inference that there's something is going to go wrong. And so what you want to do, rather than again engaging in worrying or self criticizing, what you want to do is ask yourself, what's in my control to avoid the thing that it is that I'm afraid of? If I think that I'm not good enough or undeserving, or there's something inherently wrong with me, what is it that I'm afraid could happen? And then what's in my control to prevent it? And this is kind of what I call worst case scenario exercise. What you're doing is you're tuning into the underlying anxiety and asking yourself, what is it that I'm really afraid of? And you want to really get down to the underlying question. And I talked about this in the previous episode about worst case scenario. So, but the underlying feeling and what it is that you're afraid could happen, or if it's depression or anger, then what is it that you're the underlying feeling, what is it that you're feeling hopeless or helpless about in the case of depression, or if it's anger, what is it that's hurting you, what are you feeling hurt about, for example. Okay. So again, asking yourself, what is in my control to prevent the thing that I am feeling hurt by or out of control with, or that I'm afraid could happen, if it's like rejection and failure. What am I afraid of could happen? And then the last thing that you can do in terms of dealing with imposter syndrome is, once you've done those other things, you've engaged in self validation and you've done, worst case scenario, and you've identified what it is that you're concerned about and what is in your control. Then the last thing is to redirect yourself back to the present moment. And I have an example here of my own. There was a time when anytime I heard somebody enter my waiting room, I had an inner office and I had the waiting room, and I would hear people enter my waiting room, I would get this rush of anxiety because, I wanted to make sure that I helped them. And so I was experiencing performance anxiety, right? And so I I asked myself, this is a great example of that, the what's in my control kind of technique is, I said to myself, okay, what is it that I'm afraid of? I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to help this person, or that I'm going to disappoint them, right? And so then I asked myself, well, if that's the case, then what's in my control to avoid that from happening? And so what I tried to do is I tried to focus on being in the present moment, listening to what my patient was saying. And so, whatever anxiety I had, I just kept redirecting myself back to the present moment. I was aware that it was there, but what I didn't do is I didn't get sucked into analyzing it, or panicking over it and saying, "Oh my God, I'm feeling anxious. Why I wish this would go away. I didn't get frustrated with myself about it." It's just every time that I started to feel anxious, I would just go back to, okay, let me focus on what this patient is saying, right? And trying to listen to them so that I can help them, because by listening to them and helping them, well, that's how I avoid the very thing that I'm afraid of, which is bad performance, right? And what I found over time is that as I kept doing that, the performance anxiety went away, right? I didn't give in to the anxiety. I was problem solving oriented, and I did what was in my control. And so I didn't need the anxiety anymore. And remember, we talked about this in the first episode about why we have feelings to begin with. The feelings are there to help us to be proactive, to tell us there's something that we're overlooking, either a need or a threat. And so what this was telling me I was overlooking was that I was concerned about doing a good job. And so the best way for me to ensure that I do a good job is to focus on being present, being in the moment, right? Rather than letting the anxiety pull me out of the moment and worrying about something that could happen or rehashing something that I already did. So that is redirecting yourself back to the present moment, focusing on what's in your control. So I will stop there. Those are some really great questions. And I thank Claire and I thank Mama Foxfire for submitting them. And you can do the same thing. Um, Now that you've watched this episode, you can enter your questions in the comment area. I would also love your feedback. So if you found this helpful, like and share this episode. Um, Also, if you want to be notified of future episodes, I am going to be doing Ask Me Anything live every Fridays at 12 noon. So if you want to be notified so that you can ask a question live and listen to other people's questions live, then go ahead and click on the little bell and you will be notified when it's time, when it's Friday at noon to join in. And if you want more content, then you can go to ElaineBelson.com. I have a website there where I have articles, more articles on or psychoeducational articles like on anxiety and on self-esteem. And I have a bunch of other podcasts that you can listen to. So again, that's ElaineBelson.com. And I look forward to seeing you next Friday at 12 noon. Have a great weekend.